aspirated. Let's look at this in more detail. In English, we have p, t, k. You try it. Pill, till, kill. Okay? Or maybe just use the back of your hand. Pill, till, kill. You feel the air blowing on the back of your hand. Well, what's interesting is, in English, if you put an S in front, spill, still, skill, the P, T, K lose their aspiration. Try it now. First say pill, till, kill. Pill, till, kill. You can feel the aspiration. Now say spill, still, skill. Now, you might want to say to me, yes, but I felt air coming out. But the air was to do with the S. So separate the S from the P and go spill, still, skill. And if you notice, the P, the T, and the K lose their aspiration. And that's what the B, D, G is in Chinese. It's the P of spill, the T of still, and the K of skill. And so the B is unvoiced, vocal cords not vibrating, and unaspirated, no air coming out. Now let's look at P, and what's key about that is that there's lots of aspiration. In fact, aspiration, the presence or lack of aspiration, is a key facet of Chinese. You take B as against P, you take D as against T, you take G as against K, or zhi, chi, ji, chi. Aspiration, presence or lack of it, is a key distinction in Chinese. And so you need to tell your student, for the aspirated sounds, there must be lots of air. M, no problem, English and Chinese is the same. F, no problem again, English and Chinese is the same. So they're the four sounds to do with the lips coming together. Now let's look at the teeth, and what we need to notice in Chinese is that D, T, N, L are all dental, not alveolar. Let's look at D, T, and let's look at what this means. Dental, not alveolar. In Chinese, you notice where the tongue tip is touching. It's touching the back of the upper teeth. Where in English, the tongue tip is slightly farther back, and that hard bit. And let's put them together. You see on the left, the dental of Chinese, the tongue tip slightly further forward, touching the back of the upper teeth. Where with English, the tongue is touching the hard gums at the back. And in Chinese, D, T, N, L are all dental, where in English, they're all touching that hard bit. So we need to tell our students, your tongue tip for Chinese must be slightly further forward. Also, just as we've said about B, it's not voiced, it's not aspirated, the same with the D. So D in Chinese, not voiced, not aspirated, and it's dental, not alveolar. N and L. We've already said they're dental, not alveolar. And so actually this comes in English in one particular place. In the word tenth, that N is dental because of the TH. It's the N is slightly further forward. And with the L, health in English, again because the TH, the L is slightly further forward. So in English, it's normally alveolar, but with tenth and health, the N and the L are slightly forward, the same position as for Chinese. Now let's move to the next group, the back of the tongue. G, K. These aren't much of a problem, but just remember that the G is the K in skill, unvoiced, unaspirated, where the K, lots of aspiration. As regards the H, especially if your native language, like Afrikaans, has something like this, we have to be very careful that we do not overdo the friction. You take 很好, the 很 has a certain amount of friction, but the 好 has very little. But for Afrikaans speakers, if they're not careful, obviously Dutch speakers, German as well, they go 很好 and overdo the friction. Now it's really quite light. So if your native language has more friction, just be careful you don't overdo it with the Chinese. Now let's move on to what's called palatal, and this is where the tongue tip is touching the back of the lower teeth. G, chi, shi. And so you need to tell your students they must have their tongue tip touching the back of the lower teeth. You find some students, the word to think, 想, some say 想, 我要想一想. What they're doing is they're substituting an SH and moving their tongue up rather than 想, where the tongue tip should be behind the lower teeth. And this is where particularly a mirror comes in useful, where they can look and see 想 is my tongue tip in the correct position, touching the back of the lower teeth. As regards shi, you hear two different pronunciations, like the word like, 喜欢. Some people say 喜欢. But when we teach our students, it's best to go for 喜欢, tongue slightly further back in this position, rather than 喜欢, where the tongue, the middle of the tongue, is slightly further forwards. That's ji, chi, shi. The key thing, tongue tip behind the back of the lower teeth. Now let's move on to the next group called retroflex, where the tongue is curled back. And we have this with zhi, chi, shi, ri. Note with these four sounds, zhi, chi, shi, ri, it's a northern China, southern China distinction. In the north of China, they curl it back, retroflexy, zhi, chi, shi, ri. But in the south of China, they don't. So for those learning in the south of China, I tell them simply just to substitute for zhi an English J as in John, for chi an English CH as in Charles, and for shi an English SH as in Sean. Now, let's look at SH and R. Shi, ri. In Chinese, this is the only pair of consonants where there is a voiced, voiceless distinction. Shi, not voiced, ri, voiced. Now the shi isn't a problem, as we've said, we can substitute an English SH, but the ri is probably the most difficult sound for foreigners to learn. Actually, if they can speak French, it comes in French. Jaune, yellow. It's fairly similar to the word azure in English, but not quite the same. But what you need to tell your students is that their tongue should move upwards. The tongue tip should be up and the sides of the tongue touching the sides of the mouth. What you find is that students will often substitute an English R, as in red or ready. 他是美国人, 他是英国人. And what you need to say is, no, it's not an English R. You need to move the tongue up to the roof of the mouth, the front of your tongue, so you can hear the friction, that's very key, and the sides of the tongue touching the sides of the mouth. 人. Try it now. Move the tongue tip up, sides, 人. Now, you may say, yes, but I don't hear Chinese making as much friction as you do. But what I like to say to students is, overdo the friction while you're learning the sounds, so that when you relax, it doesn't regress to an English R, as in red or ready. 美国人, no, 美国人. So get them particularly to focus on that sound and get it right at the beginning. Then the final group, oh, there's the SH, is z, c, s. The z isn't much of a problem because it comes in English. You take the word woods. At the end, woods is the z. What about the c? Some people assume if z comes in woods, c comes in hats. But that's not correct. In fact, if you do this, woods, hats, there's no air coming out of either of them. Woods and hats is a voiceless voice distinction. Woods, voiced, hats, voiceless. The problem for students with the c is it doesn't come in English. And so they've never made this sound before. Now, obviously, it's not that they can't make aspirated sound, because they can say t, they can say ch, they can say k, they can say t. But they've never made this ts before. And so it's a real problem. And so what I say to students is, use the back of your hand and you have to feel the air coming out. Ts. Now, we're going to focus on this sound a bit later. But the key thing is to get them blowing air out. Z, no air. Ts, lots of air. Finally, the S, it comes in the English word months. So the S, the tongue tip forwards, often the tongue tip's touching the lower teeth and the tongue blade up the top. S, which isn't much of a problem for students. So they are the consonants, and then we're going to now move on to the vowels.